Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to talk to you a bit about some of our next door neighbors. Yes, the ones in the graveyard. As you came into the hall tonight, many of you walked by this tombstone, which lay next to the road. This is the tombstone of John Long, my great-great-grandfather, and one of the very first immigrants to West Galway. John Long arrived in Upper Canada from Rathkill, Limerick County, Ireland in 1823 with his wife and 6 children. He was one of a group of Irish Palatines who pioneered the land south of Denton Robinson in the area now known as Fisher's Quarters. Who were the Palatines? They were originally refugees from the German Palatinate, which had been devastated by a war with France. At the time, Germany was not a unified country. It was broken up into all these little duchies. They called them, they called the area the Palatinate. France wanted to claim the rich farmland and vineyards along the Rhine River. Many of the towns and farms were burned and sacked, forcing residents to flee. Sorry, I missed the slide here. That's a picture of John Long. And that is the Palatinate area of Germany. Many of them fled in boats down the Rhine, winding up in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. In the early 1700s, Britain's Queen Anne arranged for refugees to come to England. Some were offered free passage to the colonies, and others were distributed to various parts of Britain where they were needed as laborers. As Queen Anne was Protestant, any Catholic refugees were immediately deported back to Europe. More than 13,000 Palatines made their way to England in the summer of 1709 alone, totally overwhelming in its resources to cope with such a large influx. The reason the English government supported the Palatines was they saw it as a Catholic versus Protestant issue. The French king was Catholic, and the majority of the refugees were Protestant Lutherans. The government saw the refugees as a chance to increase the Protestant population of Ireland, which was predominantly Catholic. So in 1709, some 3,000 Palatines were transported to Ireland. Some 538 families were settled as tenants on the estates of the Anglo-Irish landlords. But the problem with the resettlement was the small stipend offered by the government was not nearly enough to help them get established. They needed to be fed, clothed, and housed before they could start returning any income to the landlord's estate in the form of crops. I haven't been able to find any information on what conditions were like for them in Ireland, but we do know the refugees were already in poor shape when they reached Ireland and had little more than the clothes on their backs. They were probably also malnourished and disease-ridden. By late 1711, 352 of the Palatine families had left their holdings and either returned to England or gone elsewhere. Those that remained settled mainly in Limerick, in the area around Court Matrix. This was due to the generosity of one man, Sir Thomas Southwell, the owner of Castle Matrix and its estate. At considerable expense to himself, he provided the refugees with the necessities of life to get them established. He was eventually partially reimbursed by the Crown, but only near the very end of his life. John Long's family were tenants farmers on the Southwell estate. Now, the main problem with being a tenant farmer is you will never own the land you are farming. The offer of free land in Canada in the form of Crown land was no doubt what encouraged John and his family to emigrate to Upper Canada. He arrived in June of 1823 at the age of 44 years with his wife and 6 children. His eldest son Richard also applied for a land grant. And this is what the papers look like. You can see that's almost impossible to read. This is an oath of allegiance that all the people who got Crown grants parents had to make, saying they were loyal to the crown. And, oops, how do I get back? Okay. And I considered it a difficulty. I did manage to translate the papers, the petition of John Long, etc., etc. And he was granted 200 acres of land on the 8th line. The hamlet received its name in the area now known as Fisher Corners. And this is a sign from Fisher's Corners. Oh, by the way, he signed his name with an X. He was illiterate. He could not read or write. Yeah. And here is the one parcel of land. And I think that's the second one. This one was definitely his. This one might have belonged to his son, Richard, his eldest son, Richard. I do know that after Richard's death, it was occupied by his widow, Jane Long. So also for Jane Long. Anyway, here's the sign at Fisher's Corners. The hamlet received its name when settlers by the name of Fisher arrived in 1824 and settled at all four corners. They were Irish palliatives for County Limerick. This settlement of mostly Irish farmers soon became known as Irish Town. A church, school, and blacksmith shop flourished. It was a meeting area for the militia during the rebellion of 1837. Somewhere on the net, once upon a time, I found a list of militia members. Samuel Long, one of John's oldest sons, was a member. Unfortunately, I didn't save the list and haven't been able to find it since. This is something to learn if you're researching your family history. Always save a hard copy. Go back to that link. It may no longer be there.
Just a screenshot.
Yeah. Now, I have two issues with this sign. One is obviously the spelling of Palatine, and the second is that the Fishers occupied all four corners of the crossroads. The earliest map I really have of the area is the one you saw previously from 1871. There's only one Fisher living there. I also came across a list of settlers in West Gwillimbury prior to 1837, and there's only one Fisher on the list. I'm sure at one time the Fishers did occupy all four corners, but I think it was well into the 20th century that happened. Okay, first record we have of John Long is from the Canadian Census of 1861. I know it's kind of hard to read. That is John Long, farmer, his wife Eliza, Elizabeth, Joseph Long, his youngest son, and Letitia Long, Joseph's wife. And then John Long was a 14-year-old boy. I believe he belonged to Richard Long, who had passed away, and he was being fostered by his uncle. The census was taken early in 1861, as John passed away in February at the age of 82. It shows the Longs were living in a brick house, while all of John's neighbors were still in log homes. Log property formed the center of the community. And as I said previously, there's a school on the property, and all it was its duty as a church until Sutherland's Methodist Church was built. And later the Longs worshipped next door. After John's death, his son Joe purchased the property next door and sold part of his father's farm to Sam Hutton. That's the John Long house. Sorry, I don't have a better picture of it. That's Joe Long. And then here is the map. Joseph Long. Now we have three Fishers on three of the four corners. I guess the fourth one came when Joseph Long sold the property. There's Samuel Hutton's farm. And he will figure, as Huttons will figure in the story later. Joe was extremely unfortunate when it came to his spouses. He and Letitia had 2 children together, Sarah and Christopher. Then Letitia died from a liver abscess in 1879. He then married Melinda Wilcox, who gave birth to Carmen Long before dying in April of 1880, shortly after giving birth. In August of 1880, he married Annie Hannah Gregg, née Watson. On April 3rd of 1882, she gave birth to my grandmother, Annie Louise Long. She then passed away about a month later, on May the 12th. I'm going to have to sit down on the stage. Getting old is not fun. If you look at the histories of families from this period, you will find this happen very frequently. The spouses would pass away due to complications of childbirth, and the husband would often remarry and go on to have second batch of children with the next spouse. And 10 children in a family was not at all unusual. Now, one of the most surprising things I found in my research was that Annie Long's death was not due to childbirth. I was always told that it was, that she died from a postpartum infection, but I found a copy of the birth certificate. It turns out it was inflammation of the bowels of 4 days duration, and that sounds like it was probably an appendix related. So, what do you do when you're left to raise a tiny infant without a mother? Well, you find her a wet nurse. And due to everyone having such large families, that wasn't very hard. Joe's next door neighbor, Mrs. Houghton, nursed Annie, rocking her in the same cradle as her own daughter, Laura. The 2 girls became good friends and remained close for the rest of their lives. That's the death certificates. And there is Laura Houghton, now Laura West. Oh, shoot. I don't know what I did there. Sorry. Mrs. Houghton's sister, Mary Hawley, also helped take care for the two girls. When Mary was in her old age, Annie invited her to stay in the Jeffrey home so she could be looked after. She had a bedroom on the main floor. My father recalls hearing her say her prayers every night as she knelt beside the bed. Now, unfortunately, Joseph Long's 4th wife was not the ideal stepmother. She was very mean to Annie, and even broke her nose by hitting her in the face with a pot. Annie's mother had been married previously to a man named George Gregg and had 6 children by him. You see the children listed there. Georgina Alice Bell, Winfred Gregg, Maxwell Robert Gregg, Alice Gregg, Anna Gregg, and Anna Louise Jeffrey. Sometime around 1874, disaster struck the family, and she lost her husband and all but 2 of her children. The survivors were Maxwell and Georgina. In the 1881 census, shows them living with Joe and Annie after their marriage. When Georgina was grown up, she married a doctor, Samuel Bell. At the time of Annie's death, both Samuel and his father practiced medicine in Alliston and lived nearby. Georgina and Sam were childless and asked if they could adopt Annie. The thought of losing Annie made Rhoda change her attitude towards the child. She began to treat her very nicely and bought her some nice toys and clothes. When it came time for her to choose between the 2 people, whom she didn't know very well, and her father and stepmother, little Annie chose the known over the unknown and remained with the Longs. Samuel and Georgina eventually emigrated to Alpena, Michigan, where they both passed away without having children. How different my family history would have been if Annie had chosen to go with them. Life on the farm for Annie certainly wasn't all bad. Her father was the organist for the Sutherland's Methodist Church, and Annie loved to hear him practice. My father inherited Joe's music book, and I signed the front cover. In beautiful copper plate script was written, "Joseph Long is my name, West Bloomsbury is my dwelling place, and heaven is my destination." Unfortunately, when my father retired, he drove up to Alberta to visit one of Joe's grandsons and gave him the book, so I don't have it to show it to you. Annie's mother had also been very musical. She was a piano teacher at the time she met Joe. Joe must have also taught Danny to play, as one day when the family arrived early at the Scotch Settlement Church, she sat down at the organ and began to play. It was the first time her children ever knew that she could play. Joe was considered a community leader and would often entertain visiting preachers and other important visitors to the community in his home. Annie told my father about the time an important British Army officer who had served with Lord Kitchener at Khartoum came to visit. The young Annie was so nervous she spilled gravy on the tablecloth. Annie married George Jeffrey when she was just 19, on September 4th, 1901. She was the last child living at home. It was a big help to her father and stepmother. After her marriage, Joe found keeping up the farm too much to handle, so he sold it and moved to a house on Holland Street in Bradford. He passed away 8 years later in October of 1909. Now, this is what forgiveness looks like. Just 2 years after her father's death, Annie was sharing her home with the stepmother who had been so very cruel to her. This is George's father, William, one of his daughters, Josephine, rode along the stepmother. Oops. How do I shrink that down again? Oh, there we go. So William was the eldest son, and then William Jeffrey was the grandfather. Elizabeth was his wife, and then George Jeffrey was my grandfather. And there's Rhoda. And then Annie Long, and 2 other Jeffrey siblings. In addition to helping elderly family members, Annie raised 10 children of her own. She took chickens and produce to the local farmer's market every week, driving a horse and cart, and tended a vegetable garden that was close to half an acre inside. She did all of this in a house that had no running water and didn't even get electric power until 1956. Everyone who knew her remembers her as a kind, caring, and wonderful mother. She died when I was only 3, but I remember her taking me on her knee and rocking me in her big rocking chair. One last thing, this is one of the biggest surprises I had when researching my family history. I'm a member of St. Andrew's Anglican Church in Alliston, and one day we were meeting in the sanctuary, and it was the first time I had a chance to see the stained glass windows at the front of the church clearly. This is what I saw. Oh, that's a photo of Annie. That's in the Boyd Museum, that particular photo. And there are Annie and her husband, George. That house is now owned by Rob Kiefer, by the way. Oh. And here is the stained glass window. In loving memory of Margaret Medill Bell and Samuel Bell. You remember Georgina and Greg married Dr. Samuel Bell. His father was also named Samuel and was also a doctor, and this window is dedicated to Samuel's parents, and it represents St. Luke the physician, of course. That's it. Thank you for listening. I hope I didn't bore you too much.